You're watching The John Wood Jr. Show. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Oh, hey, everybody. It is great to be able to see you. Well, I can't actually see you, but you can see me. I see you in my mind's eye, of course. I have some sense of the fact that somebody is watching me on the other end of a computer screen, a cell phone, maybe even a TV. Maybe you're using your smart DVR player, right? Get to bring up YouTube when you're bouncing back and forth between Netflix and Hulu. Anyway, whoever you are, wherever you are, I'm glad to have your attention for a moment. And I wanted to let's see, what did I want to talk about? I wanted to talk about the importance of the things we don't know. Sounds like a funny thing, right? The importance of the things we don't know. What do I mean by that? Well, I guess what I mean is this. I'm a person who works in the political space very broadly defined. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Brave Angels, you know that we work to create spaces in which individuals on the right and on the left, across political divides, across cultural divides, can find each other in conversation, can establish relationships with each other, and can proceed to collaborate on issues that are of mutual concern. Should be the way things work anyway. It seems like you shouldn't need a particular sort of organizational or institutional body to try and facilitate that sort of culture of connection. But the truth is you can't take it for granted, right? One of the reasons you can't take relationship for granted in American democratic and political life is because we can't take it for granted that we know the right answers to all questions, or that we know all the relevant information that there is to be known on any particular subject. We have to trust other people to know things we don't know. We have to trust other people to see things that we don't see. But if we don't have the capacity to communicate with each other because we distrust each other, we can't benefit from other people's capacity to see beyond what our blind spots might be. That's a practical pitch, right? For being able to build relationships, acknowledging the fact that we are limited in what we can know. But why am I saying this at this particular moment? Well, I don't know. I think it has something to do with the fact that I am feeling a little bit frustrated. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to be real. I'm going to be real for a moment, right? I'm feeling a little bit frustrated in my own position right now, out in this sort of larger political landscape of things. The reason for that is because, I'm a person who does what he does in hopes that by making it possible for individuals to, again, find each other in relationship, develop an understanding of who we are as human beings across our divides, that this can reverberate out into the larger political culture of our society and get things working in the right way again as a consequence. But one thing you discover, and one thing I already knew as a person who was once himself a nominee for Congress, somebody who once upon a time had been active in party politics in an official capacity, is that the challenge that stands between our being able to connect with each other goes beyond the philosophical differences that exist between us, but it has to do with the fact that those differences in philosophy wind up making contact where the rubber meets the road with issues of life and death, ultimately, right? I've been looking at the coverage. I had been looking at the coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, the dramatically different ways in which different sides were covering it, right? And I watched people talk about one another, talk about Kyle Rittenhouse as either a hero or a villain, making these deeply certain assumptions that they knew exactly what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They know exactly what is in the hearts and minds of people who disagree with them. And they can say without a shadow of a doubt where guilt and innocence lies, where good faith and ill intent finds itself sprouting up in the minds and in the mouths of those who disagree with them. For me, I find myself a little bit frustrated because there's so much information on every different subject that we talk about in politics. I can't take the time to know everything, and neither can you. So it becomes this this battle, this race towards characterization. Can I say that so and such a person is a fascist, or that so and such a person is a radical or an extremist because of the political flag that they wave, because of where they come down on a certain issue? Seems like a safe bet for a lot of people. Doesn't seem so safe for me. The truth is that the human experience is complicated. The human experience is nuanced. Everybody is a product of circumstances that are a little bit different for each individual, not in terms of just where you come from socioeconomically and culturally, but even in terms of your own natural psychology. Because you are an individual, whoever you are, and so am I. And we all have things that make our perspective on the world a little bit different, or a lot of bit different, from any and everybody else's, as a consequence of the fact that none of us are perfectly replicable. None of us are perfectly duplicable, right? We exist as human beings in our own right, with our own unique perspective on reality. And so it comes to me to seem like an important thing to be honest, therefore, about the things that we don't know, and that's most things, right? And to also be honest about the one thing that we can know with some degree of certainty, I think, which is what it really means for a person to be well-intentioned, what it really means for a person to want the best for somebody else. Why don't we start there in our evaluations, first of ourselves, right? And then, only after we've taken inventory of our own intentions, of our own motivations, to start to talk a little bit about what may be motivating other people, and to do so with a good deal of humility. I launched the John Wood Jr. Show with a conversation with Dave Rubin from the Rubin Report. Went on to talk to Karen Hunter of the Karen Hunter Show on Sirius XM. Then we released a conversation with me talking with a few of my social media friends, Brandon Bradford, Will Fullwood of the Contraband Wagon podcast, and Mansicada. And enjoyed these conversations. But with the first one in particular, with Dave Rubin, I had a certain intention with that conversation. The intention for me was to empathize with the things that motivated Dave Rubin's cynicism, if you will, towards his opposition, because I see him as being a person who has experienced some negative things in his life as a consequence of the fact that his politics and his way of reasoning puts him at odds with people who would judge him to be perhaps a racist, perhaps an authoritarian, one thing or the other, when that is not likely to be his intention, from my point of view. And when I had that conversation with Dave, I thought if I could empathize with him on these points of experience, me being a person who, has family members who've been called racists and Uncle Toms on account of their politics when they're not these things and so forth. Me being a person who knows what it's like to have people, scorn you for your political leanings and assume things about your character that are not true. I thought that I might be able to empathize with him in a way that could open him up or give me the opportunity to say things to him that would challenge him to be perhaps more empathetic, or to just showcase the empathy that maybe he has but doesn't always give voice to, towards some of his critics and towards some of the people who he may find himself opposed to out in the larger political landscape. I thought the conversation worked out pretty well in that direction. But after releasing the conversation, I realized that there is something that I needed to take into deeper account. Most people who watched that particular conversation seem to think that it was an inspiring conversation, at least based on the feedback that I've received. But many other people wondered, John, what are you doing? You didn't take the time to hammer Dave Rubin or to pin him to account on this statement he made or that statement he made in his past, or even in the context of our conversation. And I think that people were looking for a certain sort of cross-examination. But, the truth is that this highlights the fact, in my mind, that there are very different ways of understanding the nature of the problem that we face in the United States of America today. It is possible to understand the problem in our politics as one in which we are intellectually not lining up over shared facts and reality because some of us are liars and some of us are not, right? And maybe the best you can say about some folks who believe things that aren't true is that they've been misled by liars. Well, but there's another way of understanding the problem that we engage in American society, talking about political polarization, talking about the breakdown of our ability to communicate across cultural lines. And that, to me, is a recognition of the fact that we are not so much incapable of grasping shared facts, nor are we chiefly, I think, motivated to traffic in lies, but that rather we are, so many of us, individuals who have simply experienced things certain ways that have colored our interpretation of what facts actually are and of what the intentions are of other people, right? So, if it is the case that I have experienced race in America in a certain way, I'll give you an example. In looking at the coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, I noticed some conservative commentators and other commentators make the observation that the media was not forthcoming about the fact that or not wanting to advertise the fact that the individuals Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed or wounded were all white, because Kyle Rittenhouse had gone to defend private property from wily protesters and rioters, looters at a Black Lives Matter protest. And the media wanted to keep up the implication that what Kyle Rittenhouse had done was killed black people because he was a white supremacist. Because the idea that Kyle Rittenhouse was a white supremacist was necessary to keep the narrative of his inevitable guilt alive, as well as the larger guilt and racism of American society. Then I turned to a left-leaning podcast, so what I just explained was, the perspective that Ben Shapiro has been offering, the perspective that you hear on Fox News. Then I turned to the Bad Faith podcast, hosted by Brianna Joy Gray, who I admit I think is a fantastic commentator. And she had an activist and a public defender on, black woman, who had made the case, and they each made the case, that this perspective was crazy to them. Because for them, it's just a clear fact that African Americans are less sympathetic victims in the eyes of mainstream society than are white Americans, and that the reason why we did not see the media playing up the white identity of the people Kyle Rittenhouse had killed or wounded was because of the fact that the media ultimately wanted for Kyle Rittenhouse, major segments of the media want for Kyle Rittenhouse to get off with his crime, to get away with his having killed and wounded these individuals in the Kenosha protests, and that to advertise the fact that Kyle Rittenhouse's victims were white might be to turn off the individuals who otherwise would look askance at Kyle Rittenhouse, or who otherwise would look at Kyle Rittenhouse as having done something that was excusable in killing black thugs, because the reality would have been that Kyle Rittenhouse had killed some nice Jewish boys, what have you, and that therefore the media was careful, perhaps, to minimize the whiteness of Kyle Rittenhouse's victims. Now, for me, I'll admit that in my own bias, I tend a little bit towards the former sort of interpretation. Seems to me that in today's media environment, sympathy tends to go towards individuals of color in these sorts of situations, because there is a larger sort of sense that society has marginalized and oppressed people of color, and black people in particular, and that when you're dealing with gun violence, and that when you're dealing with law enforcement situations or protests and so forth, that people have the sense that black protesters are protesting for justice and are often villainized because of the very sorts of oppressive, militaristic subjugation of the black community that many people will say was the cause for the protests in the first place in response to the police killing of Jacob Blake. And that, of course, is a whole other story to be analyzed. But I understand where Brianna may be coming from. Because, on the other hand, there is a historical reality in American life, which is the fact that in all sorts of cases, in all sorts of contexts, legally speaking, but also in the context of just everyday mainstream society, assumptions of criminality have tended to accrue disproportionately to African Americans because there has been a stereotype that is long-standing and historic and only swelled and has exacerbated perhaps over recent decades. You know, the show Cops sort of famously was kind of based on, in a sense, documenting and ultimately feeding into this perspective that black men in particular are prone to violence and black men in particular are prone to criminality. So there's a historic context for the suspicion that some folks on the left and some black people may have, which essentially says that folks didn't want to play up the whiteness of Kyle Rittenhouse's victims, not to make Kyle Rittenhouse look bad, but to allow him to continue looking good in front of many Americans. Now, these perspectives are totally irreconcilable on some empirical level, right? Because facts are what facts are. And yet the facts are not the only important thing. And I have people telling me all the time that they are. But facts in a real sense, in terms of how they unfold in the context of human relationships and political society, don't even have an independent existence outside of how we perceive them, outside of how we interact with them. Now, is that me making a postmodernist sort of claim? Is that me saying that there's no such thing as truth? No, it's not me saying that. There is truth. But truth goes beyond the empirical fact on the ground. The truth also shows up in our subjective relationship to it because the fact of your experience is a fact in its own right. And so if we want to organize and arrange our politics in a way to where we can actually work with each other, we have to understand the fact of each other's experience before we understand how to properly relate to the fact that we are observing through that experience. Unless we think that we can have a self-governing, complex, diverse political society without having to understand how it is we can relate and communicate with each other. And if you think we can skip that part and just line up behind one ideological or one experiential sort of perspective or another, well then, I think that you're looking at the project of democracy in the wrong way. But of course, my experience tells me that. And so, in any event, I wanted to get that off my chest. I'm sure folks will agree and disagree, but there's one big thing I hope comes through in the comments I deliver here and the comments I always seek to deliver in the context of my work at Braver Angels and this movement that we are building. That is ultimately the fact that we need to understand one another better if we are going to make a society that works for everyone and one that preserves the liberty and the prosperity and the stability that we have managed to develop and hold on to so far as a nation. As unequally distributed as it may be, the good of American society is worth preserving, worth protecting, worth building upon. But we cannot do that unless we genuinely do so together. So, coming up next week, we're going to be releasing a conversation that I had with Dennis Prager. That'll be one that, some folks may anticipate with some apprehension, but I think that folks in general are going to be very interested in seeing. I will say that in looking back over the episode, I think I overtalked Dennis, and I am known for doing that sometimes with my guests. In this case, it is the John Wood Jr. show, so it's, I think a little bit more appropriate for me to talk a bit more. Part of the issue there, though, was that as I engaged Dennis, I wanted to do with him more or less what I, sought to do with Dave. I wanted to sort of agree with him on the things that we agreed on, use that common point of connection to be able to say, but Dennis, don't you think that there may be some legitimacy in the feelings and the experiences that lead people to oppose your perspective on this point of view or the other? Might there not be some legitimacy to the claims that are coming from the activist left when you take into account their experiences and look at it through those lenses? You'll see how Dennis responds to that sort of analysis. But I very much enjoyed the conversation. Dennis Prager is somebody who I grew up listening to well before I had any relationship to conservative politics and so forth, but because he was a great hero of my dad's, is a great hero of my, or at least a person my father greatly admires and has listened to for a long time. So it was sort of a funny thing for me because, I can remember listening to Dennis on the radio, 9 or 10 years old, rolling around in the car with my dad. Sort of funny at the age of 34 to have that individual on the other side of the screen in a two-way conversation. But I'm having that sort of experience more and more these days, which is fun. I enjoy getting to talk to the great people I get to talk to. Speaking of which, I had a joint appearance with Glenn Loury at the Manhattan Institute. Many folks watching me will be well familiar with Glenn. And we're going to throw up a link to that, I think, underneath this video. But you can also find it. If you can't find it on social media, I will probably get it up on the Brave Angels website. Glenn made a case for Black patriotism. And I agree that there's a strong case for Black patriotism that needs to be made. But at this event where he gave the lead remarks, I arose to offer a response to his perspectives. Agreeing with so much of what Glenn had to say in terms of the value of personal agency and the need for us to overcome, let us say, sort of the victim narrative in the context of our representation of the Black experience in American life, I nevertheless proceeded to make the case that Black Americans have been victim of historic circumstances that lead to contemporary realities in our current day that are deeply marginalizing and have to be understood in their real empirical existence, as well as the subjective sort of, experience of going through the lived realities of these social statistics of poverty, of incarceration and violence, and all sorts of other things. If we are going to effectively make the case, those of us who are so inclined, that conservative solutions or cultural narratives that may find themselves critical of critical race theory, of anti-racist orthodoxy and modern social justice, et cetera, that we have to be able to make these points, anybody who's inclined to do so, in a way that also communicates a deep understanding of the reality of the Black experience, not just the way it appears on paper, but the way it is felt in real life, the way it manifests in the stories that people actually live through, not just in 1619 or 1865 or 1965, but in 2021, where problems are far worse than many people imagine who exist outside of the space of the Black experience. Not to say that the Black experience is uniform, but that so much of it exists in a greater degree of subjugation and marginalization than we really appreciate. If we don't appreciate that fact, why should people living in dire circumstances listen to us? So, all right, folks, I just wanted to stop in the studio really quick, throw a quick message together. It is out to you. Feel free to leave your comments. I am extemporaneizing, improvising, as I tend to do. But things are moving quickly in America. They're moving quickly at Braver Angels. I look forward to continuing on this journey with each and every one of you. Whether you agree with me on something or not, I really do appreciate and love folks who are willing to express their opinions, express their agreements and disagreements in ways that clearly seek to call forth the best in themselves and the best in me. Because Lord knows I get plenty of things wrong, and Lord knows that I make plenty of mistakes. But if you're willing to walk with me, I'm committed to this project of building a house united. Until next time.